Yeah, great. Thanks, Tess. Yeah, we'll go ahead and get things started. And again, thank you everybody for spending some time with us this evening, taking time out of your schedule to learn about what's going on and being proposed on the Nez Perce-Clearwater National Forest. We're going to go over kind of what is forest planning, some of the threats that we've identified, and what our organizations are, doing to try to fight this plan. And this evening, we're very excited to be joined by Lisa Ronald at American Rivers, Kevin Colburn at American Whitewater, as well as Cindy Anderson with me and Tess at Idaho Rivers United. I'll let them kind of introduce themselves as we get going, but I'm going to get things started off with kind of what is forest planning. And my name is Nick Kunith. I am the Conservation Program Manager here at Idaho Rivers United. And I'm going to start off with, unfortunately, some kind of fairly wonky things, but bear with me. I'm going to do my best to not get too far into the weeds and kind of explain the framework that we're looking at tonight and where we're headed. So what is forest planning and why are we really here? In general, forest planning is the process that each national forest or grassland is mandated to take stock and review the lands in which they manage and reevaluate and establish their kind of general overarching management direction for their forest. And this process is governed by the 2012 planning rule, which, as its name implies, is a rule passed in 2012 that really sets the framework for what a forest needs to include in their outlines, in their plans when they're going through this revision process. And specifically, that requires the forest to use the best available scientific information when they're doing their planning process, provide opportunities for the public to be involved through comment periods. They are public lands afterwards. And also, very importantly, conduct consultation with tribes. And as the name of this forest clearly implicates, the Nez Perce-Clearwater National Forest is really encompassed wholly by the traditional lands of the Nez Perce people and contains really important treaty reserved rights, areas for cultural and ceremonial practices. So the Forest Service has, conducted that consultation, but by no means do any of us assume to speak for the tribe. And just because that consultation happened does not mean that, all the requests that the tribe had were granted. We'll have to wait and see if the tribe has their own objections or things that they don't agree with in this plan, but it was part of the process for the Forest Service to work with the Nez Perce tribe in developing this plan in particular. So specific components that really go into a forest plan, there's really kind of these backbone pieces, and those are kind of broken down into desired conditions, objectives, standards, and guidelines. And the way you can kind of think about those are desired conditions are the specific social, economic, and ecological characteristics to which a plan is directed. So I'm going to give some examples from this plan in particular. That desired condition for wild and scenic rivers. The first one is designated wild, scenic, and recreational rivers retain their free-flowing condition. Pretty straightforward, pretty clear, desired condition that the forest wants to maintain. Objectives are more time-specific statements. So looking at riparian zones for this plan, they have an objective to improve 300 to 700 acres of riparian habitat every 5 years. Standards, those are specific rules that any future project that happens within the plan must adhere to. And another very basic one is fuel wood cutting shall not be authorized within 150 feet of a stream. Pretty straightforward. And then guidelines, as the name presents, are a little more wishy-washy, that these don't necessarily have to be followed precisely as long as they meet the intent. And another one from this upcoming plan or proposed plan is to minimize sediment delivery and adverse effects to stream channels. Construction of machine fire line in riparian management zones should be avoided except when needed across streams. So there's, some wiggle room in those. So in general, these are kind of the backbones of what are inside a forest plan. Beyond those, forest plans really evaluate the land suitable for inclusion in things like the wilderness preservation system, are outlined to identify eligible rivers for inclusion in the Wild and Scenic River System, which is a big issue that we've been focused on and we'll talk about much more later tonight, develop a monitoring plan, and other issues. So why does this matter? And for our purposes tonight, a lot of our focus and what our organizations have been pretty hyper focused on is what the forest is attempting to do in regards to wild and scenic rivers. And we'll dive into that more later. But in general, this process is incredibly important because those standards and guidelines that we just talked about really dictate and determine what activities are permissible on a forest for years to come. This is supposed to happen every 10 to 15 years, but the current plans that govern the Nez Perce-Clearwater were signed in 1987 and amended in 1990. So clearly it doesn't happen every 10 to 15 years. And that's why it's so important to get these right the first time, because what is passed or what is signed has really broad reaching consequences for what happens on that forest. And in the case of the Nez Perce-Clearwater, it encompasses roughly 4 million acres of public lands that include vast wilderness areas, over 1,400 miles of streams and rivers that provide critical habitat for Endangered Species Act listed species, and of course provides incredible recreational opportunities for folks, not just in the area, but from across the country and beyond as well. So a little bit of the history of how we got here. These plans are big. They take a lot of time, and that's part of the reason why they don't happen at the timeline they're supposed to as frequently. And as mentioned, these plans have been around for quite a while. Both the Nez Perce and the Clearwater National Forests were combined back in 2013, have been managed as one since that time. And the revision process that we're really involved in now began back in 2014. So it's been ongoing for quite some time. And since then, all of our organizations have been really following the progression and commenting whenever possible, and notably following alternatives that were presented and draft environmental impact statement that came out in 2019. And during that, we got a little bit of a glimpse of what we thought they were going to attempt to do in this final plan. But in this plan that we're looking at now, preferred alternative, or the plan that they're presenting, is really a combination of little bits and pieces of all the different alternatives that were presented back in 2019, which just added to the complexity of all of us having 60 days to review and wrap our heads around what was being presented in this current plan. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Sydney.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. Hi, everyone. My name is Sydney. I am a conservation associate with Idaho Rivers United, and I'm just going to be going over the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So if we think back to the 1930s to the 1960s, our country was witnessing a notable surge in dam constructions, diversions, water resource developments within our river systems. And in 1968, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act emerged as a response and provided the greatest protections that we have for our rivers. This landmark piece of legislation really determined that certain rivers need to be conserved in their natural, free-flowing state, and we need to safeguard their inherent values for the enjoyment of our generation and future generations to come. And next slide, please. And with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, there are 4 main goals. The first one is protecting rivers in their free-flowing state, protecting their outstanding natural, cultural, and recreational values, maintaining their water quality, and requiring the development of comprehensive river management plans that protect and enhance these outstanding values of designated rivers. And with that being said, any river can be designated. However, there are some study processes a river can go through to become designated under the Act. And without going too deep into the details, the first part of it is a river can be classified as eligible for designation. And for a river to be considered eligible, it must be 1, free-flowing, and 2, it has to have at least 1 outstanding and remarkable value, which are listed there below. To further decide if a river should be included for designation, it can go through a suitability study. And Suitability is an assessment of factors to provide the basis for determining whether to recommend a river for addition to the National Wild and Scenic River System to Congress. And with those, interim protections for both eligible and suitable are administered by the federal agency that has jurisdiction over the surrounding land. And next slide. And the Act identifies and designates specific rivers as either wild, scenic, or recreational. And each of these categories comes with different levels of protection and management. And to start off, a wild river, it is typically free of impoundments, generally inaccessible except by trail. The watersheds and shorelines are pretty primitive, and waters are also unpolluted. And an example of an exceptional wild river we have here in Idaho is the Rapid River. The next step down is, or not really down, the next tier for designation is a scenic river, which are also free of impoundments. The shorelines and watersheds are very largely primitive and still largely undeveloped, but they're more accessible in places by roads. An example of a scenic river we have is the Middle Fork of the Salmon River, which was actually one of 8 original rivers that were designated through this act back in 1968. And then lastly, the last class is a recreational river, which is pretty accessible by road or railroad, and it may have some shoreline development. It also may have undergone some impoundment or diversion in the past. And a river you may all know and love is the Lochsaw River, is classified as recreational. And regardless of classification, each river that is afforded protections under the Act is administered with the goal of protecting and enhancing all the values that caused it to be designated in the first place. Also, one thing to note is that the Act goes beyond safeguarding just the waterway itself. It extends its protective reach to the surrounding environment. Once a river is designated, a quarter-mile protected buffer is established on both sides of the river, ensuring enhanced protections for riparian zones, wildlife habitat that's in that corridor, as well as protecting the floodplains throughout. Furthermore, I think it's important to look at how the wild and scenic designation can also complement other designations, as not all federal designations provide the same protections, which is something we note here in the Forest Management Plan. For instance, legislation under the Wilderness Act permits certain activities that may conflict with the preservation goals of a wild and scenic river. Just because a river flows through the wilderness area does not necessarily mean it's going to have the same high quality protections. An example of that is a water resource development project can still be allowed in designated wilderness areas if it is authorized by the president. So as of now, the best protections we do have for rivers is the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And lastly, with the Act, there's a few misconceptions that often lead some to believe that once a river corridor is designated, that the Act imposes significant restrictions on its future use. However, it's crucial to clarify that with designation, that does not prohibit development or grant the federal government control over private property that may fall within the wild and scenic boundary. Existing land uses, including recreation, agriculture, grazing, residential development, and other activities are still allowed in most cases. Only those activities that are land and water uses that threaten the values for which the river is protected will be examined for possible regulation. And final slide, please. And here we have, I think, a really phenomenal quote from our late Idaho Senator Frank Church, who was one that championed the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. The affluent society has built well in terms of economic progress, but has neglected the protection of the very water we drink, as well as the values of fish and wildlife, scenic and outdoor recreation resources. Although often measureless in commercial terms, these values must be preserved by a program that will guarantee America some semblance of her great heritage of beautiful rivers. And it's the state of Idaho plays a really important role in the history of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Two of the original rivers designated with passage of the act were Idaho rivers. One was already mentioned, was the middle fork of the Salmon River, and then also the middle fork of the Clearwater River. And this was due to the efforts that Frank Church, the efforts that he made. He played a pivotal role in developing and sponsoring this act. And while Idaho is very blessed to contain more river miles than most states, less than 1% of those miles are federally protected. And in a world facing so many environmental challenges, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is maybe more crucial today for protecting our cherished rivers than when it was first established. And with that, I will pass it on to Kevin.
All right. Hey, everybody. Kevin Colburn. I'm the National Stewardship Director of American Whitewater. And I'm going to talk to you about how this process lands on the Nez Perce-Clearwater National Forest in terms of wild and scenic river protections. Not the designated streams, but the recommended streams that the Forest Service is putting forth. So for the last 35 years, there's been 29 streams protected as eligible, around 560 miles. So great streams, everything that most of us know about the Nez Perce, we know with these streams in place and protected. When the forest planning process came around, a lot of us tried to grow that list as we do across the country. Forest planning processes are a great way to tangibly grow potential wild and scenic rivers that have interim protections in the forest plan. And then it basically creates a menu for designation. Almost pretty much every forest in the last 15 years, except for one, stops with eligibility. So you get the eligible rivers, they're in the forest plan, it's a great thing, and you move on and just celebrate. So we worked on that here. There were, I think, 750 public comments, mostly from paddlers and river enthusiasts, almost entirely actually, supporting wild and scenic eligibility on the Nez Perce-Clearwater. When we did a action alert, it was the most people that have written an email through our service ever on Aloxol in this area. So huge public input. 89 rivers were found eligible in the draft plan. We were really excited. That's like nice growth, nice, some wonderful rivers in there. But then we get the final decision, which we kind of saw coming, but we didn't know how bad it would be. And the Forest Service conducted that additional level of analysis called suitability, which is basically a political snapshot in time that leads them to say, right now, this team with this, political situation, we're going to recommend these rivers to Congress. Not actually, we're just going to put it in the plan and protect them, and we're going to release all the other rivers. So it's the only purpose of suitability in a forest plan of doing suitability is to release eligible streams. I say that because suitable rivers and eligible rivers are subject to the exact same management in the plan. So the Forest Service picked 12. That means that more than half the rivers that have been protected for the last 30 years will no longer be protected under this plan. They picked great rivers, obviously when you have this many to choose from, you're going to choose good ones. It's Kelly Creek, Cayuse Creek, Colt-Killed Creek, really great rivers, but it's not enough. So I'm going to talk about some of the rivers that came off, next slide, that were protected in the past. So there's a lot of tributaries to the Selway that were protected and won't be under this plan. Bear Creek and its tribs, Moose Creek and its tribs, Running Creek, Three Links, which is pictured here, and Gedney Creek and its forks as well. So all of those were protected, will not be in the plan. Many of those are in wilderness, and one of the Forest Service's arguments for some of these streams was that they're already protected, so we don't need to find them suitable. Of course, that's silly. There's lots of wild and scenic rivers in wilderness areas. And part of the real benefit to wild and scenic is it can cross multiple different types of land management, from wilderness to general use to roadside, and like all along there's a river and it's being managed cohesively. Next slide. Another kind of stinging loss in the plan is the South and North Fork Clearwater, as well as Johns Creek. These are big rivers, mostly roadside, delightful places, and they were let go by the Forest Service for the opposite reason. They're not protected, and the Forest Service wants to be able to do more work in those areas. So it's sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. If you're already protected, we don't need to protect you. And if you're not protected, then we don't want to protect you because we want to do work there. So we also said about these rivers and many others, they're just not that good. People don't drive by the Loxaw to go to Golden Canyon. We said things like that. Next slide. There are some Salmon River losses, Bargaman Creek, Whitebird, Slate. Next slide. And then these are misses. So these are rivers. There's a few that the public successfully got the Forest Service to find eligible, and they were about to be protected. You know, we hope in the new forest plan, and they were released through the suitability determination or unsuitability. So I'll just highlight a few of these misses that were like near wins, you know, and the rivers that are eligible. We really think they merit protection, and they're not in the current plan. Elk Creek and the Potlatch over by Moscow, very special streams, and they're coming off. Well, they're never getting on the list now. Next slide. Lolo Creek, near and dear to many people, big, beautiful stream, really important for steelhead. And it is mostly in BLM, but there's a really big chunk as well that's Forest Service, and that's not being protected. The next slide. And then a lot of tributaries to both the Loxaw and the North Fork Clearwater. So these are big creeks, fish bearing, important for bull trout, salmon, steelhead, paddling, all the things, tribal values, and they are not going to be eligible moving forward in the plan. Next slide. So when you dig into these documents, the forest plan is, I think it's like 2,000 pages. And then there's all the appendices, and then there's the forest plan, and then there's the record of decision. It's probably 4,000 pages. When you comb through it, you really see a few reasons why the Forest Service chose not to protect more streams on their forest. One, as I mentioned, it's already protected. It doesn't really hold water. The third is that they want to log. They want to do some timber harvest. Some of that is just for timber harvest, for economic use and forest products. Some of it is to treat for fuels and reduce wildfire risk. And some of it is to, you know, direct the forest towards their preferred forest type, call it restoration, I guess. All three of those are logging activities. And what I want to share is, like, you can do those things in a wild and scenic corridor. You absolutely can. You just have to do it in a way that protects the values of the river. And they basically said, we don't want that limit on us. We want to be able to do the work and not have to worry essentially about protecting the river values. We think that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is super flexible. It supports this kind of work, and it's a great fit. It's a great way to protect the river and allow the Forest Service to do these kinds of projects on the forest, many of which are actually good, you know, can be good for the river, can be, you know, restoration work can be part of protecting a value. So a couple other things. They really wanted to shrink the list. I think they just were uncomfortable with the scale of what they had. So they definitely said, rivers, you know, this river's not that good, or there's so many rivers and so many fish that we can't protect them all. So they kind of made some blanket arguments that are, you know, both sound silly and they're kind of hard to argue with as well. And then they're transparent that the politicians asked them to do this, to take this position. And by the politicians, I mean, it's the county commissions in the two counties, basically, of the Nez Perce-Clearwater. Two of them, Latah was silent. So that's kind of some of their rationales for what they chose to do. It's important to know that the suitability step is entirely optional. We're not even sure if it's legal. It's very rare that it's done, and we certainly asked them not to do it, but they did, and here we are. So Lisa's going to tell you more.
Thanks, Kevin. So I'm Lisa Ronald, and I'm the Western Montana Associate Conservation Director for rivers here in Montana. I'm a paddler. I live in Missoula. I know many of you on here, so I'm glad to see Missoula having a strong showing here. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit. I think Kevin has focused in on some of the very granular losses that we've seen in this plan. But I think when you look both practically and at the bigger picture, there are some other reasons why this plan is so negative. So some of the practical implications, if you sort of zoom out both geographically and longitudinally, is that over time, you know, with a heavy focus on logging and logging without hindrance, logging without restriction, we're likely to see decreased water quality in a lot of the streams that Kevin showed. So, you know, that means sedimentation, you know, coming into the Lochsa, right? All of the tributaries and the headwaters of the Lochsa feed the Lochsa that we know and that many of us love. So an even bigger, you know, picture than that is that absent wild and scenic protections puts these rivers at risk of future dams, future diversions, other types of water developments. For example, there are 3 potential sites that the forest admitted to on the North Fork Clearwater alone. So you might think like, oh, these are pretty remote places. There's no way that there could ever be a dam here. But I think history is starting to play itself out, that we are seeing water developments of various sizes and scales and purposes in fairly remote places that we might have thought were unrealistic years ago. So next slide. If we kind of zoom out even further, so not just looking at sort of the forest as a whole and how its rivers may change going forward in time, but we sort of zoom out even into like more of Idaho and Western Montana, sort of region 1 of the Forest Service. You know, here's a table that looks at the change in river protection in some of the more recent forest plan processes in Montana and Idaho. And you'll see that all the numbers are positive. In many cases, they're many times positive, in that multiple other forests who have undergone these plan revisions in within the last decade have increased their river protections and done so dramatically, some of them more than doubling the numbers of rivers and the numbers of miles protected. And so you see at the bottom that the Nez Perce-Clearwater stands out rather dramatically in opposition, noticeably, to its sister forests in Region 1 in different parts of Montana and Idaho. Next slide. And so if we sort of zoom out even farther, so from the forest to sort of Region 1, Idaho, Montana, and then take a look a little bit more nationally at the national consequences of this singular action, we start to see things like, okay, once is a fluke, twice is maybe a trend. And unfortunately, as of this summer, the Nez Perce-Clearwater isn't the only forest to dictate these wholesale releases of river protections through suitability. Next slide. So earlier this summer, the Ashley National Forest in Utah did a similar thing. And so again, we were aware that this might happen. And so these 2 forests are starting to set a trend that is pretty disturbing within the planning process. In the case of the Ashley in particular, they didn't reevaluate any streams that were previously found unsuitable, which means that findings of unsuitability represent these hard releases of river protections now and into the future. Next slide. So on the Nez Perce-Clearwater, this means that, for example, if Lochsa headwaters are released now, fast forward 10 to 15 years, they're not going to be available for protection. They will be dismissed as not being able to even come onto the list. And so I think this becomes even more important as, for example, our climate science shows that headwaters again of the Lochsa, and multiple other streams on those release lists that Kevin went through are among some of the only 28 rivers that the Nez Perce-Clearwater forest found are slated and predicted to be cold enough by 2040 to support a lot of the cold water fish species that this area is known for. So should other forests take this cue from the Ashley and the Nez Perce-Clearwater, such as the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana, which is facing an upcoming plan revision here in the next few years, we can expect these wholesale releases of river protections, to come now and to continue and to get worse. And so I think at the end of the day, that's a pretty scary circumstance, because what that means is that we're living right now the peak of river protection, that the most rivers that are ever going to be protected is right now, and that it only gets less going into the future through these wholesale and permanent releases that happen once and then they happen again. And so the pot just gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller as we as a country continue to face climate change, increases in population, increases in recreational use that are driving recreation to our rivers and that are making our rivers even greater and more important touch points, to our lives in urban settings. So with that, I'm turning it over to talk about what you can do to help us out.
Thanks, Lisa and Kevin, Sydney, everybody. So what you can do, and full disclosure, we had hoped to have a letter ready for you all to make it super easy, but as we've been diving into this plan analysis, there's been, fortunately, a lot of terrible plan components that we've just been so busy trying to make sure our objections are as sound as they can. And since we are in this objection process, what that really means is that only folks who have previously commented on the draft environmental impact statement are allowed to object or to have really skin in the game in the formal setting for this process. So that's what all of our organizations are drafting right now, are our formal objections that will go in front of the reviewing officer that will try to find a middle ground or an agreement. But in lieu of that, we wanted to recommend that everybody who's passionate about this or has, a connection to the Nez Perce-Clearwater and the rivers and streams within it can reach out to the regional forester, Leanne Martin. Ultimately, they will be the decider in these objections and have the authority to change course. Because as Lisa and Kevin were highlighting, this is a choice. We're not even sure that it's legal, but it's also not required. They don't have to be doing the suitability analysis, and a personal email for trying to reach the forester, I think just explaining your name and connection to the forest, the reasons you love it, and urge them to exercise their right not to perform these suitability analyses or to release all the rivers that they had found eligible, to release them from those interim protections through the study process. And through this, we hope to have a favorable outcome from the Forest Service, but we're really hoping to have a strong outpouring of public support. And just kind of on this, so Zach had a question just about kind of the legal framework, or sorry if there's an error in there. The legal framework is really, I think, the biggest way to frame your comments, and anybody else on our panel, feel free to jump in too if you have advice here, but I think really just be to emphasize that what they're attempting to do is a choice, and they don't need to do it, and they're really choosing to reduce the protections and forego some of the greatest values that are encompassed within the Nez Perce-Clearwater National Forest. And from our opinion, they're doing so purely to get rid of red tape that will make timber projects and other management activities less cumbersome. And as Kevin alluded to, they can do all of those things. They just have to do it with intention and well thought out plans. So that's really the main thing that we think is important to emphasize. And I don't know if anybody else has any recommendations on that.
Yeah, send her a nice card. Be polite, be professional, speak to rivers. Just ask for, express concern about loss of river protections, or you could say eligible river protections. in the forest plan and ask that more rivers be protected in the final plan. It's really that simple. I mean, they could not do suitability. They could do it, but do it better and find more rivers suitable. Like they've got plenty of options, but really it comes down to, please don't release these rivers from protection. In fact, please find more.
It seems like, yeah, the email address I had in there, I was forwarded from somebody else. So I believe it is Martin EN, but if in doubt, send 2 copies with, both spellings and make sure it gets in their inbox.
Yeah, so
It
I
can
just looked
be,
at the Forest Service directory and it is Martin with an E.
okay, perfect.
Correct.
But with that, we want to open it up to any other general questions as well about anything that we discussed. And I know we really focus pretty specifically on wild and scenic rivers and other things. And I know a lot of our other partner organizations have doing a lot of good work on some of the other issues with, wildlife, wilderness areas, travel management that's also encompassed in this plan. That it's really a bear to try to analyze that. There's a lot of work happening, but if you have any questions about the things that we specifically covered tonight, we'd love to answer them for you and try to make sense of some of this pretty wonky policy stuff that is really threatening some of the great resources here in Nez Perce-Clearwater.
I have 2 questions. One is what I may have missed this as we struggled to figure out Leanne Martin's last name, but what are kind of next steps, path going forward for your organizations and for us? And the second question is how how do we know if we have commented before and so have like this formal objection ability? And if so, is there something different we can do here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the next steps for our organizations are really finalizing our objections specific to this plan that, this was released the end of November. And unfortunately, that means the deadline to submit objections is quickly approaching. I believe the 29th at midnight or 11:59 is the deadline to submit an objection. And the best way to know, I suppose, if you had submitted a comment would be you can look up your own name, assuming you submitted it in your name on the Forest Service project website for the draft environmental impact statement to see if you had submitted a comment, and would be able to then formally object to this plan as well. But there's a lot of organizations and folks that are submitting objections. And yeah, we can track down that link to that project webpage for you as well. But that's really the main thing. And in lieu of that, that's why we really wanted to put the regional foresters' contact information in there as well, just to make sure that while it won't have the same, I guess, standing in kind of the process of analysis going through objection, having that public outcry in their inbox to know that this is an unfavorable, decision that is really, at odds with what the public wants, may sway their ultimate decision in resolving these objections.
Yeah,
And
it's
I
a
think just to
political
add-
process. It's a leadership judgment call for her. So, I think that the objections can handle the legal side, but it's still, I think, like Nick said, just really good for them to hear from people. Sorry, Lisa, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No worries. You and I are both jumping in at the same time. I think just, knowing that your role in this and in sort of sending thoughts to Leanne Martin is influencing the Missoula regional office. That's where this decision is going to be made, so that when employees in the regional office and Leanne start to hear all of these negative things sort of coming into the inbox from different people in the community who sort of represent different roles, different types of people, that's when they start to take notice that, like, wow, other people, not just the enviros, are paying attention to this. This has risen to the level in society of majorly problematic. And so I think that's one of the important roles of your task to email Leanne and to sort of make sure that she knows that y'all are watching. And I think that's really helpful to us.
Ben and Shay had a question. Are there good extractive projects on wild and scenic rivers that we can point to? And I assume that's as far as like timber management or kind of these management activities that are happening. And yeah, Kevin, you put in there that there's some on the Flathead National Forest and Middle Fork that have happened. And again, there's nothing in the Forest Service Handbook or the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act itself that explicitly prohibits these projects from taking place. They just have to be a little more explicit in their design and not just allow a big clear cut or broad timber treatment to happen within the riparian zone or within the boundary. And then we had another question. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, just someone asked one more time, suitability versus eligibility. I can cover that. So eligibility is the highest level. It's the first step. And it's is a river free flowing, and does it have at least one outstandingly remarkable value? So one really special value. Pretty simple test. Most forests stop there. Suitability adds politics on top of that, and it adds preferences of the decision maker, and it adds lots of other subjective layers that are really relevant for a very short time frame. But you can think of it as eligibility is good. It's simple. It's about the river. Suitability brings in politics and brings in things that are much more fleeting. And the real role of suitability in planning is to release rivers from protection. It doesn't do anything.
Hello, am I on there? Jim Paradiso here. Two questions. One, I thought the Nez Perce-Clearwater did suitability studies back in like the mid-90s and found all those rivers suitable. And so what you're saying that they're timely, did they just say, well, that was then and it doesn't count now? Because I think some of the rivers that have been dropped were found suitable in the mid-90s there. Does that sound right? Do you?
Yeah. So, and I just want to be really clear. So when rivers are found unsuitable, that's when they're released. If they're suitable, they just stay with a similar level of protection. So yes, there were rivers found suitable quite a while ago, just a few of them, but they were never memorialized in a forest plan. So they never really had teeth. That's the thing about eligible rivers and suitable rivers. They don't really have any protective power until they're embedded in a forest plan. So because those determinations were made, I don't think they were ever like, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Lisa and Nick or anybody, but or Sydney, I don't think those were ever like fully implemented.
Yeah, I mean, as far as my recollection, it was just that the team for the forest doing the study found them suitable.
Yes, that's what I remember as well.
And I think
Thank you.
that just really points to, I guess, the subjective nature of suitability, that, if that was particularly done under a different team that found them suitable, and now that we're in 2024, that is very likely a different composition of Forest Service staff, that they find it unsuitable and are taking the steps to release them from protection. So it's a very subjective process that is open for these problems that we're seeing right now. Yeah, until something is, as Kevin said, kind of codified in the forest plan or ultimately designated as an official wild and scenic river system, there's kind of open for these areas of attack, which is quite problematic. There's a question about, curious if the increase in forest fires in the West had an impact on the Forest Service decisions to reduce protections of rivers or increase in direct funding towards deterring fires. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in, but that's certainly a major theme through their rationale. And looking at this, the North Fork Clearwater in particular, so that the North Fork, they cite this in their analysis, finding it unsuitable. The North Fork of the Clearwater drainage is 800,000 acres. but the corridor that would be protected is like 25,000 acres, so just 3% of the North Fork drainage. But they still cite the protections as being kind of onerous and problematic that will prevent them from doing fuel treatments and get in the way of reducing fire risk. So they really conflate and kind of interchange the protections and restrictions that come with a corridor with the broader forest. And again, there's nothing to say that they can't do these treatments within a corridor. Even with the wild section, the highest level of protections, they can do prescribed fires, they can do timber management, they just can't do commercial timber sales. So it's really a red herring of an argument to say that we need to actively manage these rivers or the forest, and these rivers are the reason we can't do that. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that. But yeah, that's often cited, kind of contradictory that they're unable to protect the forest as a whole purely because of some of these restrictions that would come with designation or suitability. I think that's the last question I had seen. We can do a few more minutes, but if nothing else, again, really appreciate our whole panel for spending the time of their evening to help present tonight. And all of you who are here tonight. I know often, we see some familiar faces that, are already involved, but it's very important to stay engaged and know what's happening so you can tell your friends or just be informed yourself. And we really appreciate all of our supporters and members that are involved in these, less than glamorous projects sometimes. And it's important for your voice to be heard. And I know through this objection process, there's a few more barriers to entry, but rest assured, all of our organizations that represent you all are going to fight as hard as we can to try to overturn these decisions and try to see some improvement in this forest plan. Well, all right. With that, we'll let everyone get on with their evenings. And again, appreciate you spending some time. And we'll be sure to keep everybody up to date with what we hear as we work through our objection processes. And we'll definitely keep you in the loop. So thank you all for your support.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a nice evening.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I'll end the meeting now.
Thanks, Tess.